Hello viewers, welcome to my channel. When Charlie Hunnam signed on to portray Ed Gein, one of America's most notorious murderers and the real-life inspiration behind Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Silence of the Lambs, he knew he wasn't taking on an ordinary role. He was stepping into the darkness of American mythology itself. For decades, Ed Gein's name has lingered in pop culture as shorthand for horror, a mild-mannered farmer whose grisly crimes shocked 1950s Wisconsin and haunted Hollywood ever since. But for Hunnam, this wasn't just another villain to play. It was an opportunity to dissect what horror means, and where humanity ends and monstrosity begins. "I didn't want to play Ed as a monster," Hunnam says quietly, leaning forward during a press junket for the upcoming film Monster, The Ed Gein Story. "I wanted to play him as a man, a broken man, yes, but one who was shaped by his world, his loneliness, and his own warped faith." The title says monster, but I hope by the end of the film, people are asking who the real monster is. A story America can't stop telling. The Ed Gein case has been told and retold for nearly 70 years, in documentaries, horror flicks, podcasts, and books. Yet Monster, The Ed Gein Story, directed by Oscar-nominated filmmaker David Lowery, The Green Knight, a ghost story, takes a radically different approach. It's not a slasher or a gory spectacle. It's an eerie, psychological descent that aims to humanize without excusing. Lowery, known for his meditative visual storytelling, wanted to explore the isolation and repression that incubated Gein's crimes. The movie opens not with murder, but with silence, snow falling across barren farmland, a mother's voice echoing in prayer, and a son who cannot look away. "This film is about control, devotion, and denial," Lowery explains. "It's about the poison that seeps in when someone is never allowed to be human." For Charlie Hunnam, who is both producer and star, the project was a passion gamble, the kind of role that can make or break reputations. He spent months researching, visiting Gein's hometown of Plainfield, Wisconsin, and even studying Gein's real psychiatric evaluations. "What I found wasn't the monster from the tabloids," Hunnam says. "It was this deeply damaged, socially stunted man who never left his mother's orbit. I wanted to understand how someone like that becomes what he became." Beyond the horror, building a character. The film's creative team knew from the start that Monster couldn't just be another horror biopic. It had to wrestle with the why, not just the what. Hunnam describes his process as methodical but haunted. He lived in isolation for several weeks in rural Wisconsin, shutting off his phone and social media, keeping only a small Bible and his character notes. "I wanted to feel the stillness that Ed must have lived with every day, that eerie, almost suffocating silence," he says. You start to understand how someone can lose their sense of reality when there's no one to check you, no one to talk to, no world beyond the four walls of a farmhouse. Hunnam's Ed is quiet, frightened, sometimes tender, yet disturbingly detached from morality. There's a childlike innocence to his speech, a vulnerability that makes his dissent even more unnerving. Lowery calls it the most unsettling performance I've ever filmed, not because it's grotesque, but because it's empathetic. Charlie doesn't ask for sympathy, Lowery says. He asks for understanding. And that's a much scarier thing. The backlash begins. As soon as the trailer for Monster dropped, controversy erupted online. Critics accused the filmmakers of romanticizing, or humanizing, a murderer who inspired some of the darkest fiction in history. Hashtags like #CancelMonster trended briefly on X, formerly Twitter, with some viewers demanding a boycott. Hunnam anticipated the outrage. "I knew people would be angry," he admits. "They'd say, why are we giving a platform to a killer? But I think art should make you uncomfortable. It should challenge you to look at what made that person possible." He pauses, then adds, "Because if we keep pretending monsters are born, not made, we'll never see how many we're still making." Lowery echoes that sentiment. The film doesn't excuse Gein's crimes, it confronts them head-on. But it also exposes the rot beneath the American dream: repression, isolation, religious extremism, and emotional neglect. If this story makes you uncomfortable, Lowery says, that's because it's holding up a mirror. The transformation. For Hunnam, known for his rugged charm and roles in Sons of Anarchy and King Arthur, transforming into Ed Gein required erasing everything familiar. Gone were the muscles, the swagger, the glint of rebellion. He lost nearly 30 pounds for the role, adopting a slouched posture and a Midwestern accent that's more whisper than speech. His co-star, Toni Collette, who plays Augusta Gein, Ed's domineering, Bible-thumping mother, says their dynamic on set was spiritually exhausting. We had scenes where I'd scream scripture at him for hours, and he'd just sit there, trembling, Colette recalls. The energy in that room was oppressive. It felt like we were in that farmhouse again, trapped in some cursed loop of love and control. The emotional toll was immense. Hunnam says he struggled to leave Ed behind after filming Wrapped. There were nights I'd wake up from dreams where I was still him, he admits. It sounds dramatic, but it's true. Playing someone who's lost their humanity forces you to confront your own. Inside the film's philosophy, what makes a monster? At its core, Monster, the Ed Gein story isn't about murder, it's about what happens when humanity collapses inward. Lowery uses long, unbroken shots and eerie silences to draw the viewer into Gein's mental state. The farmhouse itself becomes a character, rooms filled with relics, religious icons, and the ghosts of a world long gone. Hunnam describes the film's tone as intimate horror, the kind that seeps under your skin rather than splattering across it. It's not jump scares, he says. It's the horror of being forgotten. Of being alone so long that your own mind starts to rot. The film's tagline, "Who Made the Monster?" has already sparked debate. Some interpret it as a critique of America's moral hypocrisy, others see it as a psychological study on neglect and repression. People want clear heroes and villains, Hunnam says. But the truth is, monsters aren't supernatural. They're made from very human things: fear, shame, loneliness, control. That's what scares me most. The director's vision, a meditation on madness. David Lowery's decision to tackle Ed Gein's story surprised many. Known for his ethereal, poetic style, Lowery isn't a typical horror director. But he saw in Gein's story a tragic American fable, a man twisted by the same puritanical ideals that shaped a nation. This isn't a horror film in the conventional sense, Lowery says. It's a requiem, a slow, decaying prayer for someone who lost his soul in the name of purity. He worked with cinematographer Andrew Droz Palermo to craft a visual palette that feels both beautiful and decayed, golden sunlight against peeling wallpaper, snow over blood-stained earth. The result is haunting and hypnotic, a film that looks like a dream but feels like a confession. We didn't want to exploit Ed's crimes, Lowery insists. We wanted to understand the sickness that produced them. Critics divided, audiences shaken. Early screenings at the Venice Film Festival left audiences stunned and split. Some hailed Monster as a masterpiece of psychological horror, while others called it morally troubling. Hunnam's performance drew particular praise for its restraint. Variety described it as quietly devastating, while The Guardian called it a performance that redefines the boundaries of empathy. Still, others found the film too sympathetic. A few walked out during its climax, unable to stomach what they saw as a softening of a serial killer. But that reaction, Hunnam says, is the point. If you leave this film angry, good, he says. If you leave it confused, even better. I want you to ask yourself why you're so desperate to keep monsters separate from yourself. From Jax Teller to Ed Gein, a career reinvented. For Charlie Hunnam, Monster could mark a turning point in his career. After years of playing action-heavy roles, the outlaw biker Jax Teller in Sons of Anarchy, the swashbuckling King Arthur, and the stoic adventurer in the Lost City of Z, Monster shows a side of him rarely seen, raw, introspective, and terrifyingly vulnerable. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, he admits. But it's also the most honest. Acting isn't about pretending to be someone else, it's about finding the part of you that already is. His co-star Colette agrees. I've never seen Charlie go this deep, she says. He stripped himself bare. You can't fake that kind of truth. A message beneath the madness. In one of the film's final scenes, Hunnam's Ed sits alone in his cell, carving a crucifix into the wall with trembling hands. He murmurs a prayer, half to God, half to his mother, and for a moment, he looks less like a monster and more like a lost child. That scene, Hunnam says, captures the film's essence. At the end of the day, Ed Gein wasn't a demon. He was a product of pain, of control, of neglect. And I think we all have the capacity to create or destroy, depending on what the world gives us. Lowery calls it the most important scene in the film. It's where empathy and horror collide, he says. You don't forgive him, but you understand that he was once human. And that's the hardest truth to face. Redemption or damnation? When asked whether he believes audiences will sympathize with Ed Gein, Hunnam shakes his head. No one should sympathize with what he did, he says firmly. But maybe they'll see the warning in it, the danger of isolation, repression, judgment. I don't think Ed Gein was born a killer. I think he was made one by a system that confused obedience with love. He leans back, thoughtful. That's why the film's called Monster. Because sometimes, the monster isn't who you expect. The legacy of fear. What makes Ed Gein so enduring, so culturally indestructible, is that he represents something primal, the horror that hides behind normalcy. He wasn't a mad genius or a supernatural beast. He was the neighbor who waved from his porch, the quiet man at the hardware store, the product of a world that punished weakness and worshipped obedience. Lowery and Hunnam wanted to strip away the myth and expose the man. The result is a film that refuses to give easy answers. It's not a story about murder, Hunnam says. It's a story about what happens when you bury everything human inside you, until it comes back in the ugliest way imaginable. Looking ahead, art that confronts. Despite the backlash, Monster, the Ed Gein story has already generated awards buzz, particularly for Hunnam's transformative performance. He's grateful, but cautious. I don't care about trophies, he says. If one person walks out of that theater and rethinks what makes a person evil, then I've done my job. Lowery agrees. This isn't a horror movie you forget. It's one that lingers, like a question you can't stop asking. The final word. As our conversation ends, Hunnam reflects on the paradox of playing a man so reviled, and yet, in some strange way, so human. The easy thing is to call someone like Ed Gein a monster, he says softly. It's harder to admit that the things that broke him, fear, loneliness, shame, are things we all carry. That's the real horror. That's the real story. He smiles faintly, as if from somewhere far away. Maybe the question isn't who the monster is. Maybe it's why we need them to exist.